My name is Evelyn Carter, and the last thing my father ever expected me to do was stay calm while he destroyed me in open court. She never served, he barked across the courtroom loud enough to make people in the back row turn their heads. She stole our family name. She made the whole damn story up. The room went dead silent. I could hear the old ceiling vent rattling above us. I could hear someone shifting papers beside the clerk's desk. I could even hear my own brother exhale through his nose like he was embarrassed to be sitting near me. Every eye in Marion County Probate Court turned toward me. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at the judge. And Judge Marianne Whitmore slowly rose from her chair, reached for the collar of her black robe, and took it off. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Underneath that robe was an old military service jacket, faded at the shoulders with age. And on her wrist, visible for only a second before she lowered her hand, was the same military intelligence insignia my sister Rachel once carried overseas. That was the moment I realized my father's lie was finally dying. And he knew it too. 3 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. At 58 years old, I lived a quiet life on the south side of Indianapolis. After my husband Frank passed from a heart attack 6 years ago, I settled into routines that felt safe and small. Morning coffee on the porch, church on Sundays, crossword puzzles at the kitchen table while the local news played softly in the background. I worked 25 years as a school secretary before retiring. Most people would have described me as dependable, quiet, maybe forgettable. My father used to call me weak. Harold Carter had spent his entire life making sure everybody remembered his name. In our house growing up, military service wasn't just respected, it was treated like religion. My grandfather served in Korea, my uncles served in Vietnam. My father spent 40 years introducing himself as Captain Harold Carter, even at hardware stores and church picnics. Only later would I learn most of that title was built on smoke. But as children, we believed every word. Especially my older sister, Rachel. Rachel was 6 years older than me and fearless from the beginning. Tall, sharp-eyed, stubborn as winter ice. Dad adored her when she was little because she climbed trees, fixed broken fence posts, and never cried when she scraped her knees. Then she grew older. And Dad stopped seeing her as a daughter. He started seeing her as proof. The Carter blood still means something, he'd say whenever Rachel came home in uniform during military training. I remember sitting at the dinner table one Thanksgiving in the late 90s while Dad made Rachel stand beside the fireplace so his friends could admire her medals. Rachel hated it. I could always tell. She'd smile politely, but later that night she'd sit outside on Mom's porch swing smoking cigarettes in silence while snow drifted across the yard. "You okay?" I asked her once. She stared out into the darkness for a long time before answering. "You ever feel like people love what you do more than who you are?" At 20 years old, I didn't understand the question. Now I do. Rachel served overseas in military intelligence for nearly 12 years. We never knew exactly where she went or what she did. Half the time, even Mom didn't know where to mail birthday cards. But when Rachel finally came home for good, she wasn't the same woman anymore. She startled at loud noises. She stopped sleeping through the night. And she barely spoke to Dad unless she had to. That should have told me something. Instead, like everyone else in the family, I kept pretending things were normal. Pretending became a Carter family specialty. Mom died first. Cancer. Quick and cruel. Rachel followed 8 years later. Different cancer, same cruel ending. By then, Dad had turned 78 and meaner than ever. My younger brother Thomas practically worshipped him. Thomas never served himself, but he inherited Dad's need to sound important. After Rachel's funeral, something in our family shifted. Nobody said it out loud, but I felt it. Dad stopped inviting me to Sunday dinners. Thomas stopped returning my calls. Even my own son Daniel started sounding distant whenever we talked. Then came the estate dispute. Rachel never married, no children. Her military pension and modest savings became tangled in probate after Dad insisted Rachel intended everything to remain under the Carter military legacy. That phrase again? Like we were royalty instead of regular Hoosiers with debt grief and unresolved anger. I didn't even want the money. What I wanted was Rachel's locked metal box. She'd given it to me 2 weeks before she died. "If anything happens," she whispered from her hospice bed, "don't let Dad get this." I promised her. At the time, I thought it contained old service photos or private letters. I never imagined it contained the match that would burn our whole family story down. Dad found out about the box during probate filings. That's when the accusations began. At first it was subtle. She always exaggerated Rachel's stories. Then, she likes attention. And finally, she's pretending to carry military honors she never earned. By the time we entered court that Monday morning in Indianapolis, Dad had convinced half the extended family I was some pathetic old woman clinging to borrowed glory. The truth. I'd spent my whole life hiding in Rachel's shadow so completely that people barely noticed me at all. I almost didn't recognize my own courage when it finally arrived. The courtroom itself was smaller than television makes them look. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, worn wooden benches polished by decades of nervous hands. Dad sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark suit that hung loose on his aging frame. Thomas sat beside him, jaw tight, avoiding my eyes. I sat alone. Then Dad stood up and tore into me. She never served. His finger pointed straight at my chest. She stole our name. The courtroom stiffened. She made it all up. I remember hearing somebody whisper, "Jesus Christ." But I didn't look away from Judge Whitmore. Because the second Dad mentioned Rachel's military unit, something changed in her face. Recognition. Pain. And anger. Real anger. That's when she stood up, slowly removed her robe, and revealed the old service jacket underneath. Dad's face drained white. "I know Rachel Carter," Judge Whitmore said quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then she looked directly at my father. And before this hearing goes any further, she said, "There are truths in this courtroom that should have been spoken years ago." Nobody spoke for several seconds after Judge Whitmore said those words. You could feel the air changing inside that courtroom. My father looked like somebody had kicked the floor out from under him. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For the first time in my entire life, Harold Carter looked afraid in public. Not angry. Afraid. Judge Whitmore folded her robe carefully over the back of her chair before sitting down again. Underneath the black fabric, the olive military jacket fit her like something she still respected too much to throw away. My brother Thomas finally found his voice first. "Your Honor," he said stiffly with respect, "if you personally knew Rachel Carter, then maybe you shouldn't preside over this hearing." The judge turned her eyes toward him calmly. "I knew Sergeant Rachel Carter professionally over 20 years ago," she replied. "That does not prevent me from recognizing dishonesty when I hear it." Dad suddenly slammed his cane against the floor. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "My daughter manipulated this entire situation." I almost laughed hearing him say the word manipulated. That had always been his specialty. The judge looked directly at him. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "I strongly advise you to choose your next words carefully." I saw something pass over Dad's face then. A flicker of calculation, like he was trying to decide how much the judge truly knew. Too much, apparently. Because he sat down hard without another word. The hearing recessed for lunch shortly afterward. People flooded into the hallway whispering like church ladies after a scandalous funeral. Nobody approached me. That part didn't surprise me. Families like ours teach people early which side is safer. I stood near a courthouse window overlooking downtown Indianapolis while rain slid slowly across the glass. My hands shook a little now that the moment had passed. Not from fear. From exhaustion. Keeping secrets for decades takes energy people don't talk about. "Evelyn!" I turned and saw Judge Whitmore standing several feet away holding her robe folded over one arm. Up close, she looked older than I first realized. Probably late 60s, sharp gray eyes, deep lines around her mouth that suggested a lifetime of swallowing difficult truths. "I'm sorry for the scene in there," she said softly. "You didn't create it." "No," she replied, "but perhaps I should have stopped it years ago." That sentence landed heavier than she probably intended. I stared at her carefully. "You really knew Rachel?" Her expression softened immediately. "Yes," she said, "very well once." The hallway noise around us faded into the background. "She never talked much about military service," I said. Judge Whitmore gave a sad smile. "That sounds like Rachel." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she glanced toward the courtroom doors to make sure nobody was nearby before lowering her voice. "Your sister saved my career in 1998. I blinked. What? We were stationed together briefly during a military legal investigation. Her eyes drifted somewhere far away. There was corruption involving procurement contracts overseas. I was young, naive. I trusted the wrong people. And Rachel? She refused to let innocent soldiers take the blame. That sounded exactly like my sister. Judge Whitmore's voice tightened slightly. She could have advanced very far in military intelligence if she'd played politics, but Rachel had this stubborn moral center. It made powerful people uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, because suddenly pieces of Rachel's silence started rearranging themselves in my head. The sleepless nights, the cigarettes, the distant look in her eyes whenever Dad bragged about honor and sacrifice at family dinners. What happened to her over there? I asked quietly. The judge hesitated. I'm not sure I know everything she admitted, but I know this: by the time Rachel left service, she carried burdens she should never have carried alone. Before I could respond, Thomas appeared down the hallway. There you are, he said sharply to me. He barely acknowledged the judge before turning his attention fully toward me. Dad's furious. I almost smiled. When isn't he? This isn't funny, Evelyn. No, I said, it really isn't. Thomas rubbed his forehead like he already regretted approaching me. You should have given Dad the box. There it was. The real issue. Not military honor. Not family reputation. The box. Rachel's metal lockbox had been sitting untouched in my hall closet for 3 years after her death. I never opened it because part of me feared whatever she'd hidden inside. But Dad feared it more. Why, I asked. Thomas avoided my eyes. Because Rachel wasn't well near the end. Anger finally sparked inside me. She had cancer, Thomas, not dementia. You know what I mean? No, I said coldly, I really don't. He lowered his voice. Dad says Rachel became paranoid after service, that she blamed him for things that weren't his fault. The second he said it, I knew. Dad had already started preparing his defense years ago. Not against strangers. Against Rachel herself. Against the possibility that one day she might speak. A terrible memory surfaced suddenly. Rachel sitting at my kitchen table 6 months before she died, staring silently at a coffee cup gone cold. What if somebody lies long enough they start believing it? She asked me out of nowhere. I remember shrugging back then, confused. Now I understood exactly who she meant. Thomas sighed heavily. Look, Evelyn, Dad's old, sick. Why are you doing this now? I stared at my younger brother for a long moment. Because that question haunted me too. Why now? Why had I stayed silent my entire life? The answer came easier than I expected. Because Rachel asked me not to let him have that box. Thomas looked genuinely frustrated. You always chose her over this family. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Rachel was this family. She carried it on her back while the rest of us hid behind her strength. Before I could answer, the bailiff announced court would resume in 10 minutes. Thomas walked away first. Judge Whitmore remained beside me quietly. Then she asked the question nobody else had. Have you opened the box yet? I shook my head. Number. She studied me carefully. You should prepare yourself before you do. Something cold moved through my stomach. What's in it? The judge's expression darkened. I don't know everything, she admitted softly, but I know Rachel discovered something years ago that devastated her. About what? She looked directly toward the courtroom doors where my father waited inside. About your father. Court resumed 20 minutes later. My hands trembled slightly as I carried Rachel's metal box to the evidence table. Dad watched it like a man staring at a loaded gun. And for the first time in my life, I realized something astonishing. Harold Carter wasn't afraid of losing money. He was afraid of the truth. The metal box looked smaller on the courtroom table than it had in my closet. Funny how fear works that way. For 3 years, I'd walked past that box almost every day without touching it. Sometimes I dusted around it. Sometimes I stared at it while putting away winter coats. But I never opened it. Part of me believed Rachel had hidden pain inside it. Another part feared she had hidden truth. And in the Carter family, truth had always been the more dangerous thing. The courtroom stayed unnaturally quiet as the bailiff carried the box forward. Even the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder somehow. Dad's eyes never left it. I noticed his hands shaking for the first time. Not old age trembling. Panic. Judge Whitmore leaned slightly forward. Mrs. Carter, she said gently, are you prepared to open the box voluntarily? My throat tightened. No, I answered honestly, but I'm going to. The latch clicked louder than it should have. Inside sat several neatly bundled folders tied with faded military green ribbon. Underneath them rested photographs, envelopes, and an old leather journal worn soft at the corners. The smell that rose from the box caught me off guard. Paper. Dust. Rachel's old cigarette perfume. For one painful second it felt like she was standing beside me again. I carefully lifted the first folder. Military Service Commendations. Rachel's name appeared across nearly every page. Special Intelligence Recognition. Leadership Citations. Commendations for Overseas Coordination Assignments. My father had spent years bragging about sacrifice and honor, yet Rachel was the only real decorated veteran in our family. Judge Whitmore examined several documents quietly before handing them back. These records appear authentic, she said. Dad immediately shifted forward. Nobody disputed Rachel served, he snapped. This nonsense is about Evelyn exploiting military connections for sympathy. I almost laughed. Exploit. I'd spent half my life avoiding conversations about Rachel because Dad turned every mention of her into a performance about himself. The judge ignored him. Continue, Mrs. Carter. My hands moved deeper into the box. That's when I found the second folder. Unlike the others, this one carried my father's name. Harold J. Carter. Something inside me tightened immediately. Dad noticed too. Don't open that, he barked. The courtroom froze. Judge Whitmore looked up sharply. Excuse me. Dad realized too late how suspicious he sounded. That file contains personal records, he muttered quickly. Private matters unrelated to this hearing. Rachel had written something across the folder in blue ink. Read everything. My fingers suddenly felt cold. I opened it. The first pages looked official enough at first glance. Military evaluation forms, training certifications, administrative records from the early 1970s. Then I saw the word disqualified. And another. Removed. And another. Failed. I blinked hard trying to understand what I was reading. The room around me blurred slightly. According to the documents in my hand, my father had never completed advanced deployment certification. He had been removed from active combat consideration after repeated psychological and command evaluation failures. Yet all my life he told people he served in overseas combat operations. I looked up slowly. Dad's face had gone pale gray. Thomas stared at the papers like he wanted them to disappear. Judge Whitmore extended her hand carefully. May I? I handed her the folder. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, the judge removed her reading glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. Mr. Carter, she said quietly, these records directly contradict statements you made earlier regarding your military history. Dad's jaw tightened. You don't understand military paperwork. I understand it very well. He gripped his cane so hard his knuckles whitened. You have no right. No, the judge interrupted firmly. Your daughter had no right to be publicly accused while you concealed material facts from this court. Whispers broke out across the gallery seating. An older man near the back shook his head slowly. Somebody else muttered, Lord have mercy. I sat there numb. Not because Dad lied. Deep down, maybe I always knew something about him didn't add up. Number. What shattered me was realizing Rachel carried this truth alone for years. Suddenly memories started connecting themselves. Dad exploding whenever somebody asked detailed questions about his service. Rachel leaving rooms whenever he started telling war stories. Mom crying quietly in the kitchen late at night after family gatherings. Dear God. How long had everybody been protecting him? Judge Whitmore continued reviewing documents. Then her expression darkened further. There's more here. My stomach dropped. She carefully lifted another sheet from the folder. This appears to be a sworn statement from Sergeant Rachel Carter dated 2002. Dad stood abruptly. That document is confidential. Sit down, Mr. Carter. For a second I honestly thought he might refuse. Then something inside him seemed to collapse. He lowered himself slowly back into his chair. The judge read silently for nearly a minute. When she finally looked up, her voice sounded different. heavier. "Mrs. Carter," she said softly to me, "did your sister ever discuss discovering irregularities involving your father's military records?" "Number." The judge hesitated. "This statement suggests Rachel uncovered evidence your father falsified aspects of his service history while applying for veteran leadership organizations and public honors." The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly now. Thomas buried his face in his hands. Dad looked ready to either scream or faint. And me. I just sat there staring at Rachel's handwriting. Because suddenly I understood why she became so distant after returning home. She hadn't simply seen terrible things overseas. She came home and discovered the man who raised her built his entire identity on lies. I felt sick. Not angry yet. Just heartsick. Judge Whitmore tapped the papers carefully. "There are also references here to financial threats made against Sergeant Carter if these findings became public." I looked up sharply. "What threats?" The judge's eyes moved slowly toward my father. "It appears your sister believed exposure would financially ruin the family and potentially leave you without support after your husband's business difficulties years ago." I stopped breathing for a moment. Frank's failed auto shop. The debt. Dad stepping in suddenly with money we desperately needed. I thought he was helping us. But now I understood. He wasn't helping. He was buying silence. A memory crashed into me so hard it almost made me dizzy. Rachel sitting in my living room after Dad paid our mortgage arrears 15 years ago. "You don't owe him your soul for this," she said quietly. I thought she was being dramatic. "God forgive me." She was trying to warn me. The judge closed the folder slowly. "Mrs. Carter," she asked carefully, "would you like a recess?" Before I could answer, Dad suddenly stood again. Only this time he looked old. Not powerful. Not commanding. Just old. "You think you understand anything?" he rasped toward me. "You think Rachel understood?" Nobody answered him. His breathing turned uneven. One hand pressed hard against his chest. Then his knees buckled. Thomas lunged forward just before Dad collapsed onto the courtroom floor. People shouted. The bailiff called for medical assistance. And while the courtroom descended into chaos, I sat frozen beside Rachel's open box, staring at the wreckage of the man who spent his whole life pretending to be unbreakable. The ambulance lights painted the courthouse windows red and white while I sat alone in the hallway holding Rachel's leather journal against my chest. Dad had been taken to Methodist Hospital 20 minutes earlier. Possible cardiac episode, the paramedics said. Thomas went with him without even looking back at me. The courtroom chaos faded now into distant, muffled voices and ringing telephones. Somewhere down the corridor, a janitor pushed a squeaking mop bucket across tile floors, polished dull by decades of footsteps. I should have felt victorious. For years I imagined what it might feel like watching Harold Carter finally face consequences for his lies. But sitting there beneath cold courthouse lighting at nearly 60 years old, I mostly felt tired. And sad. Judge Whitmore stepped quietly into the hallway carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "One cream," she said, handing me one. "You looked like the type." I almost smiled despite myself. I am. We sat beside each other without speaking for a minute. The coffee tasted terrible. Perfect courthouse coffee. I keep thinking I should have known, I admitted finally. "You did know." I frowned slightly. "No, I didn't." "Yes," she said gently. "You just survived by refusing to look directly at it." That stung because it was true. Families like ours become experts at selective blindness. You learn which subjects cause explosions, which questions make dinner go silent, which truths are too expensive to acknowledge. So you adapt. You shrink yourself. You survive. Judge Whitmore folded her hands carefully over her lap. "Your sister once told me something during an investigation," she said quietly. "She said people don't lie for decades because they're evil. They lie because eventually the truth becomes impossible to survive." I stared down at Rachel's journal. She always sounded wiser than the rest of us. The judge smiled faintly. "She was exhausted, Evelyn, not wise." That sentence hit harder than I expected. Because Rachel had spent so many years looking strong that I forgot strength can destroy people too. A nurse from the courthouse medical office approached briefly to update us. Dad stabilized during transport. More testing needed. No visitors yet except immediate family. Thomas still hadn't called me. Not surprising. He built his whole identity around defending Dad. If Harold Carter collapsed, Thomas would collapse with him. I rubbed my thumb slowly across the worn leather cover of Rachel's journal. I haven't opened this yet either. Judge Whitmore looked at it carefully. Rachel kept journals overseas sometimes, she said, mostly private reflections. You read them? Once or twice. Her expression softened, usually after difficult assignments. I hesitated. Was she happy back then? The judge took a long breath before answering. I think Rachel wanted very badly to believe honor and truth could survive inside broken systems. Her eyes drifted toward the courthouse windows. Then reality disappointed her. That sounded painfully familiar. My phone buzzed suddenly. Daniel. My son. For one hopeful second I thought maybe he was calling to check on me. Instead his voice sounded tense the moment I answered. What happened in court today? Straight to business. I closed my eyes briefly. Your grandfather collapsed. I heard. Of course he had. Families spread gossip faster than wildfires. Then came the sentence I dreaded. Mom, why are you doing this publicly? There it was again. Not are you okay? Not what happened. Why are you embarrassing the family? I felt something inside me harden slightly. Your grandfather accused me of lying in open court. He's old. And I'm his daughter. Daniel sighed heavily. You know Grandpa's proud. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Proud. Such a polite word for the damage men like Harold leave behind. Did Thomas call you? I asked quietly. Number. But somebody already told you I'm the problem. Silence. That silence answered everything. I stared at courthouse workers moving through the hallway while a terrible realization settled over me. The Carter family disease wasn't lying. It was protecting lies. Generation after generation. At any cost. Mom, Daniel said carefully, maybe you should let this go. I looked down at Rachel's journal in my lap. 3 years dead, and she was still carrying everybody's burden. No, I said softly, not this time. After the call ended, Judge Whitmore watched me for a moment. Your son. I nodded. He sounds frightened. I almost corrected her. But she was right. Daniel wasn't cruel. Just scared of conflict, scared of fractured families, scared of becoming the next target if he stepped outside the Carter version of loyalty. Just like I used to be. Late that afternoon, I finally drove home. Rain followed me down Interstate 65 while old country songs crackled softly through the radio. Indianapolis looked gray and worn beneath low clouds. Pawn shops, tire stores, fast food signs glowing in wet parking lots. Ordinary American life continuing while my family history collapsed in probate court. When I reached my small brick ranch house, exhaustion hit me all at once. The silence inside felt enormous. Frank had been gone 6 years, but moments like this still made me miss him hardest. My husband wasn't perfect, Lord knows he wasn't, but he had a gift for making rooms feel less lonely. I heated leftover soup I didn't really want, then carried Rachel's journal to the kitchen table. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. For a long time I just stared at the journal without opening it. Finally, around 9 o'clock, I took a breath and flipped to the first page. Rachel's handwriting slanted slightly, right neat and controlled. March 4th, 1998. Some men wear uniforms because they want to serve. Others wear them because they're terrified nobody will respect them otherwise. I swallowed hard. The next pages described overseas investigations, internal military disputes, sleepless nights, and names I didn't recognize. Then halfway through the journal I found my father's name. Harold J. Carter. The ink pressed deeper there like Rachel wrote those pages angry. Dad lied long before I enlisted. I confirmed it today through archived personnel review records. He never deployed into active combat. Worse, he used fabricated stories for public recognition inside veteran organizations for years. My chest tightened painfully. But the next sentence hurt even more. Mom knows. I froze. Number. I kept reading. She's known since 1976. She begged me not to expose him, said the humiliation would destroy the family and kill him. Maybe she's right, but every time he lectures people about honor, I feel sick listening to it. I covered my mouth with one hand. Mom knew. All those years. All those dinners. All those speeches about sacrifice and integrity. She knew. Suddenly, my childhood memories shifted shape completely. Mom calming Dad after military reunions. Mom changing subjects whenever detailed service stories came up. Mom constantly asking Rachel to keep peace in the family. Dear God. She hadn't been protecting truth. She'd been protecting him. Tears finally came then. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet grief rolling down my face while rain whispered outside the house. Because I realized something devastating. The women in my family spent their whole lives cleaning up emotional wreckage left by fragile men pretending to be strong. And Rachel died carrying that burden almost entirely alone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother standing at the kitchen sink in our old Indiana farmhouse, silently drying dishes, while Dad told another exaggerated military story in the next room. Back then I thought she looked peaceful. Now I realized she looked tired. There's a difference. By morning the rain had stopped, leaving the neighborhood washed clean beneath pale gray skies. I made coffee, fed the birds in the backyard out of habit, and sat at the kitchen table staring at Rachel's journal again. I wasn't sure I wanted more truth. But I couldn't stop now either. Around 9:30 my phone rang. Thomas. I answered immediately. How's Dad? A long pause. He's alive. Not warm, not relieved, just factual. I closed my eyes briefly. What happened? Stress-triggered angina. They're running more cardiac tests today. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Then came the bitterness. You happy now? There it was. I rubbed my forehead slowly. No, Thomas. He's humiliated. He humiliated himself. Another silence. Then his voice softened unexpectedly. You don't understand what this is doing to him. Anger flickered inside me for the first time in days. No, I replied quietly. You don't understand what he's done to everybody else. Thomas exhaled sharply. Dad built his whole life around service. And Rachel gave her whole life to actual service. That shut him up. For a moment all I heard was hospital noise in the background. Distant carts rolling, intercom announcements, somebody coughing nearby. Then Thomas spoke again, lower this time. He keeps asking if the box is still with you. Of course he did. Even lying in a hospital bed, Dad feared Rachel's truth more than his own health. What else is in it? Thomas asked carefully. I don't know yet. Evelyn. His voice changed suddenly, less defensive, more tired. You know, Mom wanted peace. I stared out the kitchen window at the wet backyard grass. Mom wanted survival, I said softly. That's not the same thing. After we hung up, I opened Rachel's journal again. Several pages later, tucked between entries, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. Evelyn. My chest tightened instantly. Rachel's handwriting always affected me that way after she died. It felt like hearing a voice through walls. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Sis, if you're reading this, then either I lost my nerve again, or things finally exploded after I'm gone. First, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I left you alone with all this. Tears blurred my vision immediately. I kept reading. You were always kinder than me. That sounds like a compliment, but sometimes I worried kindness would bury you alive in this family. Dad built himself like a house with rotten beams. From the outside, everything looked proud and solid. Inside, everything depended on nobody pushing too hard against the walls. I swallowed hard. Rachel continued. I found out the truth during an internal records audit in 2002. At first I thought there'd been some mistake. Then I confronted Mom privately. She cried for 2 hours, said Dad came home shattered after failing military evaluations as a young man, said he couldn't bear the shame while his brothers served successfully. So he started adjusting stories over time until eventually even he couldn't separate truth from fiction anymore. My hands trembled slightly. Not because I doubted it. Because I suddenly understood my father more than I wanted to. The letter continued. I wanted to expose him at first. God knows I did. But then Frank's business collapsed. You were drowning financially. Dad stepped in with money he barely had because guilt had become the only language he truly understood. I closed my eyes painfully. Rachel knew everything. Every sacrifice. Every manipulation. Every hidden crack in the family foundation. And she carried it alone. The next paragraph broke me completely. Please don't hate Mom too much. She spent 40 years trying to keep this family from exploding. I think somewhere along the way she forgot that surviving and living aren't the same thing. I cried then. Really cried. Not graceful movie tears. The kind that leave your chest aching afterward. Because Mom deserved better too. All of us did. Near the bottom of the letter, Rachel's handwriting grew shakier. Dad loved us the only way he knew how, through control, fear, and reputation. Weak men often confuse those things with love. But listen carefully, Evelyn. Do not become him. Do not let revenge become your whole life after I'm gone. Truth matters. Humiliation doesn't heal anybody. I stared at those words for a long time. Because deep down part of me had started wanting Dad to suffer publicly the same way Rachel suffered privately for years. Rachel knew me too well. At the very end, she wrote one final sentence. For once in your life, little sister, stop shrinking yourself to protect other people's lies. I pressed the letter against my chest and cried harder. Around noon, somebody knocked on my front door. I assumed it was a neighbor. Instead, Daniel stood there. My son looked uncomfortable the second I opened the door. 40 years old now, tall like his father, nervous eyes like mine. I was nearby, he said awkwardly. No, he wasn't. But I stepped aside anyway. He sat at the kitchen table while I reheated coffee neither of us drank much of. Finally he spoke. Grandpa says you're trying to destroy him before he dies. I almost laughed from exhaustion. Of course he does. Daniel rubbed both hands together nervously. He sounded really upset. I studied my son carefully. You know what? Nobody's asked me this entire week. He frowned slightly. What? Whether any of it's true. That hit him harder than I expected. His eyes dropped immediately. I don't know what to think. Then think for yourself. He looked genuinely miserable. Mom, Grandpa helped us all growing up. Yes. He paid for my braces. Yes. He helped after Dad died. Yes. I leaned forward slowly. And sometimes people who help us are still deeply flawed. Daniel stayed quiet. So I stood up, walked to the counter, and handed him Rachel's letter. Read this. He hesitated. Then he started reading. Halfway through, his expression changed. By the end, his eyes looked wet. She really wrote this. Yes. Daniel stared down at the pages for a long moment. Then very quietly, almost like a child again, he asked, why didn't anybody tell me any of this before? And suddenly I understood the real damage done by my father's lies. Not stolen honors. Not fake stories. Silence. Generations of silence passed down like inheritance. 3 days later, we returned to court. The sky over Indianapolis looked pale and brittle that morning, the kind of cold spring day where winter still refuses to fully let go. I arrived early, carrying Rachel's journal and letter inside an old canvas tote bag Frank once used for fishing trips. My hands felt steadier now. Not because I wasn't afraid. Because I was finally tired of being afraid. The courthouse hallway buzzed quietly with lawyers, clerks, and families carrying their own private disasters into small beige rooms. Probate court teaches you something quickly. Most inheritance battles aren't really about money. They're about old wounds. And ours had been bleeding for decades. Thomas stood outside the courtroom when I arrived. He looked exhausted. His dress shirt hung wrinkled beneath his coat, and deep purple shadows sat under his eyes. Dad came anyway, he muttered. Part of me wasn't surprised. Harold Carter would rather die in public than disappear quietly. How is he? Thomas hesitated. Weaker. Then after a pause, he barely slept. Neither had I. We entered the courtroom together without another word. Dad already sat at the plaintiff's table. For one painful second, my anger disappeared entirely. He looked old. Not commanding, not intimidating, just fragile. His skin had gone gray around the cheeks. The knot of his tie sat crooked. Even his hands looked smaller, somehow resting beside the cane. Age had finally stripped away the performance. But when he saw me, the old hardness returned instantly. Like armor. Judge Whitmore entered moments later. This time she wore her robe normally, though something about her posture felt more personal now, less distant. Court resumed quietly. The judge reviewed the prior evidence first, speaking calmly, while the courtroom listened in near silence. Nobody whispered today. Nobody shifted impatiently. People sensed something final approaching. Then Judge Whitmore turned toward me. "Mrs. Carter," she said gently, "you may continue if you wish." I stood slowly. My knees trembled slightly beneath the table. Not from weakness. From the weight of finally speaking honestly after a lifetime of silence. I carried Rachel's letter and journal to the witness stand. Dad stared at them like they were loaded weapons. And maybe they were. I took a long breath. "My sister Rachel served this country for 12 years," I began quietly. "She believed honor mattered, truth mattered, responsibility mattered." The courtroom stayed completely still. She also spent the last years of her life carrying secrets that nearly destroyed her. Dad shifted angrily in his seat. "Evelyn." "No," I said calmly. That single word shocked even me. I had never interrupted my father publicly in my entire life. Judge Whitmore watched silently. I looked directly at Dad. "You taught us reputation mattered more than honesty," I said softly. "You taught us appearances were everything." His jaw tightened. "I gave this family structure. You gave this family fear." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Thomas lowered his eyes. I continued carefully. "Rachel discovered years ago that parts of your military history were fabricated. She struggled with that truth deeply because she loved you." Dad's face reddened instantly. "You know nothing about sacrifice." "No," I replied quietly. "Rachel did." Silence spread across the courtroom again. Then I did something I never expected. I stopped attacking him. Because suddenly I understood Rachel's final warning completely. Humiliation doesn't heal anybody. So instead of exposing every ugly detail hidden in Rachel's files, I folded the papers carefully and looked at the judge. "My father lied," I said. But the lie didn't begin because he was evil. Dad stared at me stunned. I swallowed hard. It began because he was ashamed. That changed the entire room. You could feel it. People stopped seeing a villain and started seeing an old man cornered by his own failures. I continued slowly. "When my father failed military evaluations as a young man, I think something inside him broke. Instead of facing that pain honestly, he built another version of himself. One people would admire." Dad's breathing turned uneven. "But lies grow," I said softly. "And eventually whole families begin organizing their lives around protecting them." I glanced toward Thomas. Then toward my own son sitting quietly in the back row. Children learn silence from watching adults survive. Daniel looked down immediately. I felt tears threatening now, but I kept going. My mother spent 40 years trying to hold peace together. Rachel sacrificed her own peace, protecting the rest of us, and I spent most of my life shrinking myself to avoid conflict. I turned back toward Dad. "No more." The courtroom remained utterly silent. Dad's eyes looked glassy suddenly. Not angry anymore. Lost. "I never wanted to destroy you," I told him quietly. "I just wanted the truth to stop poisoning everybody around you." For several seconds he said nothing. Then something astonishing happened. Harold Carter started crying. Not politely. Not quietly. The kind of broken crying older men spend entire lifetimes trying to avoid. His shoulders shook once, then again. Thomas stared at him in total shock. I realized then my brother had probably never seen Dad cry either. Dad pressed trembling fingers against his mouth. "I tried," he whispered hoarsely. Nobody moved. I tried so hard to matter. Dear God. There it was. The real confession. Not military fraud. Not fake honors. A lifetime of desperate insecurity hidden beneath pride. Dad looked toward me with tears running openly down his lined face. "My brothers came home heroes," he said brokenly. "People respected them. Your mother looked at them differently. Everybody did." The courtroom stayed frozen. When I failed, he swallowed hard. I couldn't bear it. I felt my own tears falling now too. Not because he deserved immediate forgiveness, but because pain passed through families like weather if nobody stopped it. Dad looked down at his hands. "Rachel hated me for it." "No," I said softly. "Rachel was heartbroken." That nearly destroyed him. He covered his eyes briefly. For the first time in my life, Harold Carter looked small enough to tell the truth. Judge Whitmore allowed the silence to remain. Nobody rushed the moment. Finally, Dad lowered his hand slowly and looked at me again. I don't know how to fix any of this. I took a long breath. You start by stopping the lies. He nodded faintly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, my father asked me something I never once heard him ask in 58 years. Can you sit with me a while? And somehow, against every instinct revenge had built inside me, I quietly answered. Yes. 6 months later, I stood beneath a maple tree outside the Indianapolis Veterans Legal Assistance Center, watching young women carry folding chairs across a small grassy courtyard. The wind smelled like fallen leaves and fresh coffee. October in Indiana always brings that feeling that the world is quietly preparing itself for change. A small bronze plaque rested on an easel near the entrance. The Rachel Carter Memorial Scholarship for Women Entering Military Legal Service. I stared at Rachel's name for a long moment. Not hidden. Not whispered. Not carried like a burden anymore. Just honored honestly. People slowly gathered for the ceremony while soft conversation drifted through the courtyard. Veterans in old service caps, retired court employees, a few law students from Indiana University, ordinary Americans carrying ordinary griefs and private histories. Judge Whitmore stood near the coffee table speaking with 2 young scholarship recipients. She looked different outside the courtroom somehow. Softer, human. When she noticed me, she smiled warmly. Beautiful morning, she said. It is. She glanced toward the plaque. Rachel would have hated all this attention. I laughed quietly. Yes, but secretly she'd be proud. The judge nodded. I think so too. Life had changed slowly after the hearing. Not dramatically. Real healing rarely happens dramatically. Dad publicly corrected his military records through several local veterans organizations. The process embarrassed him deeply, but he did it anyway. Some old friends stopped calling afterward. Others surprised us. A few veterans told him privately they respected the truth more than the performance. That mattered to him more than he admitted. Thomas struggled the hardest. For months, he barely spoke during family dinners. Losing the myth of our father felt almost like losing childhood itself, but eventually he began asking questions instead of defending silence. That was progress. As for Daniel, my son and I started talking honestly for the first time in years. Not perfectly. Not magically. But honestly, one Sunday afternoon he admitted something painful while helping me clean the garage. I spent most of my life afraid of upsetting people, he said quietly. I smiled sadly. That makes you a Carter. Then I added, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We both understood what I meant. Dad arrived late to the scholarship ceremony. The old Harold Carter would have demanded attention the second he appeared. This version walked slowly with his cane, nodding politely at people without trying to command the room. Age had thinned him considerably. He moved carefully now, like somebody finally aware his body was temporary. But when his eyes found mine across the courtyard, something softer existed there too. Not pride. Not authority. Humility. He stopped beside me quietly. You look nice, he muttered awkwardly. I almost smiled. Compliments still sounded unnatural coming from him. Thank you. He looked toward Rachel's plaque for a long time without speaking. She deserved better from me, he finally said. Yes, she did. But I'd learned something important these past months. Some apologies arrive too late to repair the past, but still early enough to change the future. Dad cleared his throat roughly. I've been thinking about your mother lately. That surprised me. What about her? His eyes stayed fixed on the plaque. She spent her whole life trying to protect me from shame. He swallowed hard. I don't think I ever thanked her properly. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my chest. Because despite everything, part of me still remembered the young version of my parents before fear hardened them both. I think she loved you very much, I said quietly. Dad nodded faintly. I loved her too. A long pause followed. I just didn't know how to be weak around anybody. That sentence explained almost his entire life. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Judge Whitmore spoke first, followed by a retired military attorney who briefly described Rachel's service. Nothing exaggerated, nothing theatrical. Just truth. And somehow truth felt more powerful than all Dad's old stories ever did. When my turn came to speak, I stepped carefully toward the podium, while autumn wind rustled through the trees overhead. I looked out at the small crowd. Then I began. My sister Rachel believed integrity mattered most when telling the truth became uncomfortable. The courtyard grew quiet. She carried burdens silently for many years because she loved her family, but silence can become dangerous when it protects pain instead of healing it. I noticed Dad lower his eyes slightly. I continued softly. Our family spent generations confusing strength with pride. We thought hiding weakness made people respectable. A few older heads in the audience nodded knowingly. But real strength, I said, begins when somebody finally tells the truth with compassion instead of cruelty. My voice nearly cracked then. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't speaking as the quiet daughter hiding in corners. I was simply myself. And that was enough. After the ceremony ended, people lingered beneath the trees, drinking coffee and sharing stories. Daniel helped stack chairs nearby while Thomas awkwardly made conversation with Judge Whitmore. Progress. Slow, imperfect progress. Dad sat alone briefly on a wooden bench near the parking lot. I walked over quietly and sat beside him. For a while we just watched leaves tumble across the grass. Then he spoke without looking at me. You know, I used to think respect meant nobody seeing your failures. I waited. But Rachel? His voice tightened slightly. Rachel saw all mine and still kept loving me anyway. Tears stung my eyes unexpectedly. Yes, I whispered. She did. Dad nodded slowly. I wish I'd told her thank you. Some regrets never fully leave us. Maybe they shouldn't. A cold breeze swept through the courtyard. Dad pulled his coat tighter around himself. Then, after a long silence, he looked at me carefully. You think she'd forgive me? I thought about Rachel's letter. About her warning not to let bitterness consume me. About my mother spending decades holding broken people together the only way she knew how. Finally, I answered honestly. I think she already did. Dad looked away quickly, blinking hard. We sat there together quietly while late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the grass. Not healed completely. Not magically transformed. Just human. And maybe that's enough for most families in the end. Later that evening, I drove alone to Crown Hill Cemetery carrying fresh white chrysanthemums. Rachel's grave rested beneath a large oak tree near the older section of the cemetery. Leaves covered the ground around her headstone. I placed the flowers gently beside her name. Then I sat there for a while beneath the fading Indiana sky. You were right, I whispered softly. Truth matters. The wind moved gently through the trees overhead. For the first time in many years, the silence around me no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a parent, a sibling, or even yourself, maybe it's worth asking what truths still deserve compassion before time runs out. Sometimes families don't heal because the past disappears. They heal because somebody finally becomes brave enough to face it honestly. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if stories like this speak to your heart, you're always welcome to return, listen, and share another quiet evening together.